It all started on a quiet Saturday morning. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek. I had just finished my morning coffee and decided to take advantage of the cool air to mow my lawn. My job as a software engineer kept me busy during the week, and weekends were my only chance to catch up on household chores. I had barely started the mower when I noticed her. Across the street, standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, was Margaret Hargrove. She was in her late 50s, with a sharp bob of silver hair and a perpetual frown etched into her face. Margaret was the self-appointed queen of Willow Creek, and she ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist. She was also the VYC president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, a position she wielded like a weapon. I ignored her and continued mowing. 15 minutes later, a police car pulled up in front of my house. I turned off the mower, wiping sweat from my brow, as an officer stepped out. He looked almost apologetic. "Sir, we received a noise complaint," he said, glancing at his notepad. "From your neighbor, Margaret Hargrove." I stared at him in disbelief. "You're kidding, right? It's 7:30 in the morning. People mow their lawns at this hour all the time." The officer sighed. "There's no law against it, but your HOA has a noise regulation until 9 a.m. They've asked us to remind you." That's when I realized this wasn't just about noise. This was personal. Margaret had been eyeing my house since I moved in 6 months ago. She didn't like the fact that I kept to myself, that I didn't attend her weekly neighborhood socials, or that I had the audacity to paint my front door a deep shade of blue without her approval. I forced a smile. "Fine, I'll wait until 9 o'clock. But tell me, officer, if there's no law, what exactly are you enforcing?" He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Just try to keep it down," he muttered before getting back into his car. As soon as he left, Margaret strolled over, radiating fake concern. "Oh dear, I do hope this won't be a recurring problem," she chirped. "Some of us enjoy our peaceful mornings." I clenched my jaw. "You could have just asked me yourself, Margaret." She gasped as if I had slapped her. "I pay HOA dues, and I expect the rules to be followed." She sniffed before spinning on her heel and marching back to her house. That was the beginning. The next day, I received an official warning from the HOA. Apparently, I had been verbally aggressive toward Margaret, and any further infractions would result in fines. I knew then that this wasn't just about Margaret. She had the HOA wrapped around her finger. I did some digging and discovered that Margaret was best friends with Richard Grayson, the HOA president. Richard was a retired lawyer in his late 60s, with a smug demeanor and a penchant for wearing sweater vests. He acted like he owned the entire neighborhood, and in many ways, he did. Things escalated quickly. A week later, I got another notice. My front lawn was not up to HOA aesthetic standards. The kicker? It was because of a single patch of slightly taller grass near the driveway. They gave me 48 hours to fix it or face a fine. It was OBVYS. This wasn't about lawn care. This was about control. I mowed the entire yard that evening, just to be safe. But the next morning, my trash was still sitting on the curb, uncollected. I called the waste management company, and they said my pickup had been delayed due to non-payment. That was interesting, considering I had autopay set up. I pulled up my records. Payments were fine. Someone had called and canceled my SARE VYC. That same afternoon, I found a bright red violation notice taped to my front door. Excessive debris left on property. Due lot $250 fine. I stood there, staring at the notice, feeling my blood pressure rise. This wasn't just the HOA being annoying. This was deliberate. I decided to fight back. That night, I installed security cameras around my house. The footage from the first night was uneventful, just the usual suburban quiet. But the second night, I saw something that made my blood boil. Around 2 a.m., two figures in dark hoodies walked up to my driveway. One of them dumped a pile of trash bags onto my lawn, then snapped a photo presumably for another violation notice. I rewound the footage, pausing when one of them turned slightly toward the camera. It was Richard Grayson. That's when I knew this wasn't just about HOA pettiness. This was personal. Instead of confronting them directly, I decided to gather EVY Denke. I printed out still images from the security footage and started citing my neighbors. I casually brought up the HOA's recent VY, and to my surprise, many of them had similar stories. Mysterious fines, inexplicable rule changes, and even threats of foreclosure over VYL infractions. Margaret noticed what I was doing. By the time I reached my fourth house, she was outside, arms crossed, glaring at me like I just torched her rose bushes. "You're spreading rumors," she snapped. "I'll be reporting this." I gave her my most pleasant smile. "Great. While you're at it, let Richard know I have security footage of him illegally trespassing on my property." The color drained from her face. For the first time since this all started, she actually looked nervous. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. It was an email from the HOA. Final notice. Multiple violations. Immediate compliance required. Failure to comply will result in further action. I scrolled through the email. They had attached photos of me trash bags mysteriously appearing overnight, my lawn with patchy discoloration, and even a picture of me speaking with neighbors. According to the HOA, that last one was unauthorized solicitation. I clenched my jaw. They weren't just trying to find me into submission. They were trying to break me. I called my lawyer, Emily Carter, a fierce woman who had dealt with HOA nightmares before. She listened carefully as I explained everything. "They're testing you," she said. "HOAs thrive on people folding under pressure. But if they falsified anything or selectively enforced rules against you, you've got leverage." That was all I needed to hear. I spent the next few days documenting every fingernails, violation notices, security footage. I even made a spreadsheet tracking their violations against me versus those of my neighbors. But things got worse. Late one night, I noticed something unusual on the security footage. A car pulled up in front of my house, and a figure stepped out, pouring something onto my lawn. It was herbicide. They were killing my grass. I bolted outside with a flashlight, my heart pounding. The smell of chemicals hit me immediately. I checked the footage again. The car they drove? It was Margaret's. The next morning, I printed stills from the footage and drove to the police station. The officer at the front desk raised an eyebrow when I explained everything, but once I showed him the footage, his demeanor shifted. "This is trespassing and property damage," he said, jotting down notes. "We'll send someone over to take a statement." As I left the station, I spotted Richard sitting in a car parked nearby. He was watching me. He knew, and he wasn't happy. With Emily's help, I filed a formal complaint with the state. The EVY Denke was overwhelming fraud, intimidation, and possibly racketeering. The HOA's financial records were scrutinized, and the corruption ran deep. One by one, the board members resigned. Richard was arrested, and Margaret vanished overnight. The HOA was dissolved, and any remaining funds were used to reimburse homeowners who had been scammed. I stood on my porch, watching as the last remnants of their control over the neighborhood were loaded into a truck and driven away. The neighborhood was finally free. But as I locked my door that night, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "You may have won, but some of us don't forget." I stared at the screen, my fingers tightening around the phone. A warning, a final scare tactic. But I wasn't afraid, because this time, they knew exactly what they were up against. Certainly, below is the continuation and conclusion of the story, expanding on the aftermath of the HOA's downfall and introducing new challenges for the protagonist. The story builds toward a climactic resolution while maintaining the tension and drama that has driven the narrative so far. The neighborhood of Willow Creek was finally free from the tyranny of the HOA. For the first time in years, residents felt a sense of relief. The oppressive fines, the constant surveillance, and the petty rules were gone. But as I stood on my porch, watching the MOVY truck carry away the last remnants of Margaret Hargrove's belongings, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. The text message I received the night before still lingered in my mind. "You may have won, but some of us don't forget." It was a chilling reminder that while Richard Grayson was behind bars and Margaret had fled, there were still those who remained loyal to their corrupt regime. I tried to push the thought aside and focus on the positive. The neighborhood was coming together in ways I hadn't seen before. People were talking to each other, sharing stories of how they had been wronged by the HOA, and even organizing a block party to celebrate their newfound freedom. It felt like a fresh start, but not everyone was ready to move on. A few days after the HOA's dissolution, I began to notice strange things happening around my house. My security cameras captured shadowy figures lurking near my property late at night. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, but then the incidents became more brazen. One morning, I woke up to find my car vandalized. The words "Leave now" were spray-painted across the hood in bold, black letters. My stomach churned as I realized this wasn't just a random act of vandalism. Someone was sending me a message. I called Emily, my lawyer, and filled her in on the latest developments. "This is getting out of hand," she said, her voice tense. "We need to take this seriously. Whoever is doing this isn't just trying to scare you, trying to drive you out." I agreed. But without concrete evidence, there wasn't much we could do. The police had already been involved in the HOA case, and they were stretched thin. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I began to dig deeper into the HOA's inner workings, hoping to uncover any remaining allies of Richard and Margaret. What I found was disturbing. The HOA had been more than just a neighborhood association. It was a front for a larger operation. Richard had been funneling money from the HOA's funds into offshore accounts, and Margaret had been using her position to manipulate real estate deals in the area. But the most shocking revelation was the existence of a secret group within the HOA, small but powerful faction that had been working behind the scenes to maintain control. They called themselves the Willow Creek Syndicate, and they weren't going to let a little thing like the HOA's dissolution stop them. I knew I had to act fast. If this group was still active, they could cause serious harm to the neighborhood and to me. One evening, as I was reviewing security footage, I noticed something unusual. A black SUV had been parked down the street for hours, its engine running, but no one getting in or out. I grabbed my phone and called the police, but by the time they arrived, the SUV was gone. The next morning, I received another text message. "You're playing a dangerous game. Stop now, or face the consequences." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. This was a direct threat. I decided to confront the syndicate head-on. I printed out everything I had, uncovered financial records, emails, and security footage, and distributed it to my neighbors. I wanted them to know what we were up against. The response was overwhelming. People were angry, but they were also determined. For the first time, the neighborhood was united against a common enemy. The syndicate didn't take kindly to my efforts. A few days later, I received a sit from two men in dark suits. They didn't introduce themselves, but their message was clear: back off, or things will get ugly. I refused to be intimidated. With Emily's help, I filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office, providing all the evidence I had gathered. The case quickly gained traction, and soon, the syndicate was under investigation. But they weren't going down without a fight. One night, as I was working late, I heard a loud crash from outside. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the front door, only to find my mailbox ripped off its post and thrown across the lawn. My security cameras caught the whole thing: two men in hoodies, their faces hidden, working quickly and efficiently. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the men were long gone. The officers took my statement and promised to increase patrols in the area, but I knew that wasn't enough. The investigation into the syndicate was moving quickly, but so were they. A few days later, I received a call from Emily. "We've got them," she said, her voice filled with triumph. "The state just issued arrest warrants for the remaining members of the syndicate. It's over." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But as I hung up the phone, I noticed something strange on my security cameras. A figure was standing at the edge of my property, watching my house. I zoomed in, my heart pounding. It was Margaret Hargrove. I didn't wait for the police. I grabbed my phone and ran outside, determined to confront Margaret once and for all. She was standing in the shadows, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes burned with anger. "You think you've won," she hissed. But you have no idea what you've started. I stood my ground. It's over, Margaret. The syndicate is finished. You have nothing left. She laughed, a cold, bitter sound. You're naive if you think this ends here. There are others people you don't even know about. They'll come for you. They'll come for all of you. Before I could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police had arrived. Margaret's eyes widened in panic, and she turned to run, but it was too late. The officers surrounded her, and within moments, she was in handcuffs. As they led her away, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, anger, and a lingering sense of unease. Margaret's words echoed in my mind. They'll come for you. With the syndicate dismantled and its leaders behind bars, the neighborhood of Willow Creek finally began to heal. The residents came together to rebuild what had been broken, and for the first time in years, there was a sense of hope and unity. I sold my house a few months later. The memories of what had happened were too fresh, too painful. But as I drove away from Willow Creek for the last time, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. I had stood up to corruption, and in doing so, I had helped set an entire community free. As for Margaret's warning, I chose not to dwell on it. Whatever threats still lurked in the shadows, I knew I had the strength to face them. Because in the end, it wasn't just about winning, it was about standing up for what was right. And that was a VY Tory worth fighting for. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this VY Deo with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next VY Deo.